Welcome back to the Enfield Diaries, where this time we're looking at these reflector plinths. This is what the best of the two that were on my car looked like, but you can see that made of steel, they do tend to rot a little bit. The worst of the two sides quite clearly are badly corroded, and the rubber peeled off to reveal a rather sorry looking piece of material, clearly not useful again. One end has rusted off completely. I've converted this into an approximate template so that I can make several of these, but I actually only need two. So let's convert this blank into the pedestal that I need. I started marking out the blank with a paint pen, but I folded it in the vise because I didn't want the corners to be razor sharp and angular. So hand bending, checking it of course was at 90 degrees, actually matched the outline really nicely and made a really good bend in the end. I had practiced this on the first one to start with and found that most of the time I could get the bend pretty accurate. I did have to use a hammer a couple of times just to extend and increase the curvature very slightly, and kept checking the fit with the main chrome surround. So I've got a good fit along the top and around the corners, and it's a reasonably tight fit. It's just a slight pop in. So now I'm going to mark these corners and bend the bottoms. These corners were a lot trickier. I did try to use the pliers to start with, but the corners were quite tricky to form and much more difficult to get bend. I resorted eventually to using the vise, despite the fact you can't bend it the full 90 degrees, and then had to go back to using the vise and faff around quite a lot until the fit was quite good. I checked that the reflector would fit in the stand, and that allowed me to trim the bottom edges with tin snips so that the reflector would fit properly. So that's a reasonable fit now, all the way around the outside of the reflector bezel. So the reflector now mounts in, and there's just room along the top to fit that thickness of stainless in, and then these little ears finish just before the reflectors start. I used a slitting disc to cut the angle of the pedestal to match the car. The rear of the Enfield is sloped at this point. I had to thin it as well, and of course treat both ends identically. It was quite a small, delicate thing to hold. I used a flat disc then to smooth all the edges so that they were nice and smooth, and this was quite tricky to get to the inside edge particularly. One has to check the fit along the top and along the side. You also have to check that, despite the fact it doesn't look quite right, the front face is actually near vertical. The next job was to make the little bar that goes at the back and supports the two pieces together. It was quite easy to cut and make this fit well. So that's the two units, not welded together yet, but complete. Top one's got the reflector unit in, so the reflector sits flush, and then the screws hold the whole lot in. But this bar is needed to hold the reflectors in the pedestals. I don't often weld stainless, so I've had to change my wire wheel and the gas. So now I'm ready to weld the item back together. I've set a depth gauge to check that there's enough clearance for the reflector to fit in. I've welded the back of the bar into the support shrouding. That should then fit nicely over that, and that bar then holds that reflector nice and firmly in position so that it doesn't rattle. And then using the original screws, which I will replace, that's what the finished item should look like, mounted on the car. Nice and solid. It just needs a coat of satin or gloss black. So this is the completed unit. Looks rather smart. Faces the rear, and the reflectors still work. Another fix on the Enfield 8000.